So as someone who likes to play Diablo 4 while relaxing and also watching YouTube or even Netflix on the side, this build is essentially a godsend to me. With some of the new mechanics introduced in Season 1 for the Necromancer, you essentially have a build that can operate almost entirely on autopilot. And whenever you do decide to push a little bit harder, the buttons are still there for you to press to be able to do a little bit more damage. And when it comes to endgame World Tier 4 content and higher level Nightmare dungeons, there are definitely endgame builds that you can easily transition into without necessarily having to rely on finding a specific unique item. And even then, you can still go back into so-called autopilot mode for, say, speed farming with just a quick and simple gear swap. But before I touch on these endgame options, let's first go through how some of the mechanics of these builds work, the main progression skill build, gear, and aspects, as well as how to successfully progress into World Tier 4. So with that, the first mechanic that is absolutely crucial, I would say, for all the variants of this build is the new Caged Heart of the Sacrilegious Malignant Heart, which not only triggers the corpse skills that are on your bar, by the way, automatically, but also does it in quite a smart way. First, it actually prioritizes the corpse skills on your bar from left to right. So what you'll usually want to do is to have your summon skeletons on the furthest left of your bar so that it'll actually cast and continually max out your number of skeletons, although it will not cast the skeletal priest healing for you, which in a sense is good because it won't just stop at that skill and keep spamming the skeletal priest, right? It'll actually move on to the next skill, which will generally be corpse tendrils. So you basically have automatic corpse tendrils that'll be coming out and stunning enemies and crowd controlling them and allowing you to deal more damage, especially if you have the aspect for it, which I'll touch on aspect later. But the cool thing about the corpse tendrils here is that it will cast corpse tendrils on a fairly short cooldown, so it will not be able to spam it constantly, but the internal cooldown is about 4 or 5 seconds, which is still very good. And on top of that, it does not trigger the cooldown of your corpse tendril skill on your bar, which means you can cast it yourself as well on a separate cooldown. And you can even time it in such a way, for example, after the heart casts corpse tendrils, you wait for a few seconds for the stun on your enemies to almost wear off, and then you can cast your corpse tendrils to continue the perma CC or perma stun, so to speak. And of course, after these conditions for both of those skills are fulfilled, assuming they are on the left side of the bar, right? Then Corpse Explosion will be the next skill that this gem will essentially spam for you. And even with the slight damage reduction you get from this auto cast gem, the number of corpses you'll generally be able to generate should be more than enough to offset the reduced damage, and also especially with the extra cast that you'll actually be getting off, because keep in mind that casting a spell also takes time with your casting animation. So by having this gem not triggering your casting animation and you still be able to use your spells independently of it, it actually greatly speeds up your overall casting and gameplay and just convenience and power as well. And I think it's to the point that this will feel especially bad for players after Season 1, after these Malignant Hearts are essentially retired, if people have gotten used to using these effects. So Blizzard better put together a crazy or even crazier Season 2 with even more convenient and quality of life effects like this, or just roll it into some kind of permanent aspect or effect for the Necromancer, please. Now for the second Malignant Heart we're using for this build, we have the Caged Heart of the Decrepit Aura. Although not as crucial as the previous Malignant Heart for the corpse skills, this one is nonetheless extremely convenient and helpful, especially since it actually frees up a skill on your skill bar while still allowing you to use that skill essentially. And that skill happens to be a very good one, the Decrepify Curse, which if you still spec into it on your skill tree, you can still benefit from not only its effects, but any of the enhanced passive effects that you have from your skill tree, even if it's just not on your skill bar, right? And this can not only increase your skill options in terms of what you can put onto your skill bar instead, but also it again saves you from that precious casting time. And because it's an aura around your character, you don't have to continually cast it again on different packs of mobs or different individual monsters, as long as your character is close to those monsters. Now, if you're more interested in the endgame builds, I will be getting to those very shortly. But first, let's talk about progression and how best to basically autopilot your way into World Tier 4 even. And a lot of the skills and aspects and explanations here, I'll just go through once now, and then later on for endgame builds, I won't have to explain them again. And so for my primary progression build here, and by progression I mean comfortably being able to do at least World Tier 3, I've first of all taken Reap for the corpse generation. 1 point, or you can max out if you want, into Blight, and especially Supernatural Blight, which will increase yours and your minions' damage to your enemies. And then for the Corpse and Macabre skills, first of all, we want to max out Corpse Explosion and also take the Shadow Pool Blighted Corpse Explosion, and this will be one of your main sources of damage, which will also go along with the Autopilotness with the Malignant Heart auto-casting your Corpse Explosions for you, right? And then we also take Blood Mist for survivability and also the passive to generate even more corpses. I actually have Skeletal Warrior Mastery here to have some more damage from my warriors. And then below for my curses, like I said before, I have the Decrepify and its improvements with the Lucky Hit reducing cooldowns. Skeletal Mage Mastery as well for extra damage again from my mages. And then for my Darkness skills, I basically want to upgrade all the damage passives here, as well as the movement speed passive Reaper's Pursuit. Of course, for the auto cast, we also have Corpse Tendrils, and this also increases our damage via making enemies vulnerable. Then below I have a bunch of these summoning passives that I take. The main ones you'll want to prioritize are attack speed for minions, as well as the one where minions don't take more than a certain percentage of their life per hit, which will be very useful in higher difficulties, and for proccing stuff for the attack speed. And by proc, I mean Shadow Blight, because all forms of shadow damage from your minion attacks, if you do the shadow versions of them, and also your dot damage and your pool damage from your Corpse Explosion, they'll all contribute to proccing Shadow Blight, which will be a significant added source of damage for you too. And for any of your extra leftover points, you can put them into any damage passes you prefer, aside from the summoning ones like Fuel for Death, Grim Harvest, the Death's Embrace, which will also reduce damage taken. Amplified damage is great as well. And of course, Huge Flesh is probably one that you should actually prioritize as well, and it's extremely good, especially if you can get some extra lucky hit into your build. And so with this particular build, which again is the build I primarily followed up until World Tier 4, where I made a few adjustments to accommodate for the increased difficulty and sort of the minions falling off, but we'll get to those endgame build alternatives very soon. The primary damage sources of this build are not only your minions, which still actually do decently well even in World Tier 3 as I found, especially with the shadow damage variants proccing your Shadow Blight key passive, and with your Shadow Blight key passive being increase in damage from your various aspects, which I'll get into as well. But besides that, we also of course have your Corpse Explosion pools, which will be triggered extremely frequently with your own casting, as well as Blood Mist if you have the aspect, as well as of course the Malignant Heart. And so actually a lot of your damage, if not most of it, can be automated, again through minions and this passive Corpse Explosion damage, all triggering Shadow Blight. You actually don't have to go out of your way to press any buttons really to be able to do damage. But of course, if you do decide to spam Corpse Explosion, your Skeletal Priest occasionally to buff your minions, and also use your Blight of course to increase your damage and your minions damage, and also deal damage on its own, that would be more ideal. But if you wanted to, say if you're watching YouTube or Netflix or whatever and just want to chill and not focus too much attention on the game, this build will perfectly be able to allow you to level up quite smoothly even without having to operate or think very much. Now onto legendary aspects, I would say that there are 3, perhaps 4 that are mandatory, and all of them can be obtained from either dungeons or from the Season 1 Season Journey. And one of them is in fact the Aspect of Decay, which benefits your Shadow Blight key passive. This was previously only obtainable from gear, but in Season 1 you can actually get it as an aspect from your codex by completing Chapter 3, which is relatively early, I would say before you need to go into the Capstone Dungeon to upgrade to Nightmare difficulty. And before you complete Chapter 3 and unlock the Aspect of Decay, you can really go with any build that you prefer and it would still be viable. But if you wanted to go along with the Season Journey, you can actually consider doing Blood Lance or even Bone Spear. Chapter 1 gives you a Blood Lance related new aspect, which is quite strong and good for AoE, and then Chapter 2 will give you one for Bone Spear. But once you do get the Aspect of Decay, and coming back to our Shadow Minions build, the other offensive aspects you want to pick up are just basically 2 more. First, we've got the Blighted aspect from Akon's Grasp in Hawazar. This one is very strong and you generally want to prioritize it for say your amulet or even a 2-hander for the added bonuses, right? And then the other one would be the Aspect of Grasping Veins. This you would put on gloves or rings generally, and this will give you some extra power whenever you cast your Corpse Tendrils, or if you have the gem whenever that auto casts, your tendrils will buff you as well. And so those three would form basically the core of your darkness damage, but some other really good ones to pick up include the aspect of reanimation, which will increase your skeleton's damage, the aspect of the umbral, which can help with resource generation, and then especially in World Tier 3 you want to pick up aspect of disobedience as well for the needed survivability. And so I would say that as long as you have these 6 aforementioned aspects, the rest are really not that important and can just be, again, flex picks, such as you can use the explosive mist one for some reduced cooldown on your blood mist. You can use the might aspect for extra damage reduction. You can use some movement speed ones like Ghost Walker or Wind Striker on your boots. And then you can also benefit from the extra skeletal warriors or mages aspects if you find those as well. And with that, going into actual late game builds, transitioning into World Tier 4, you generally want to forego minions because their damage tends to fall off in World Tier 4, although I guess technically they could help with your survivability, or you could go with Golem if you want. I actually like Bone Storm because I also have the Bone Storm legendary aspects that gives me a barrier, as well as another one that turns it into shadow damage, which will benefit my Shadow Blight as well. But anyhow, you generally want to pivot into one of 4 builds for the endgame, including the Corpse Explosion Blight Necromancer, which doesn't actually require you to have any specific uniques, and which is what I'm demonstrating right now. So that's actually a perfectly viable endgame build. And the playstyle is generally the same as your previous near autopilot Shadow Necromancer, except again you're foregoing minions generally to go for the sacrifice bonuses on your skill tree, and also just leaning completely into your shadow damage. Or you can go into Infinimist, although that would generally require a bit of, say, cooldown reduction and lucky hit chance for you to be able to maintain near infinite blood mist. And by the way, if you're not really familiar with what Infinimist is referring to, it's essentially a blood mist corpse explosion build that does not take any core skills and focuses on, again, reducing your cooldown on your blood mist while relying on damage from corpse explosion and the corpses that blood mist generates. However, I would recommend still sticking with the core skill Blight with Corpse Explosion, which is the previous build that I mentioned, as opposed to transitioning right away into Infinimist upon hitting World Tier 4, because it generally requires you to have a certain level of lucky hit chance and perhaps even cooldown reduction, as well as ranks to Blood Mist, to be able to keep the cooldown low enough for you to be able to really maintain your Blood Mist, right? But if you do want to do it, you want to make sure to have these aspects, mainly the aspect of Explosive Mist, because it not only allows Blood Mist to also trigger Corpse Explosion when you get into contact with a corpse, and of course with your skill tree passive, your Blood Mist will also generate corpses, right? But not only that, but upon detonating each corpse, you also reduce the cooldown of your Blood Mist further. And besides that, you also generally want the Bone Storm aspects, and again, be able to maintain uptime on your Bone Storm by being able to reduce its cooldown through the Decrepify passive, which is also why I recommend equipping instead of just having the Malignant Heart for it, Decrepify for more on-demand cooldown reduction. And I guess this is actually the most important thing, but having Howl from below is greatly beneficial for the Infinimist build, and it is actually generally not really recommended to go for Infinimist until you are able to pick up one of these clubs. Which, by the way, causes your corpse explosions to essentially become homing corpse explosions, which whenever you traverse over a corpse, it wouldn't matter where the enemies are, and your corpse explosions would be able to actually home in on them. And so the Infinimist build is usually considered more of a later late game build, if you will. So if you can actually get it going though, it'll actually be extremely powerful for especially pushing tougher content. If the results from last season, for example, people were able to clear pre-nerf level 100 Nightmare Dungeon with it, or any indication. And before I go back into more depth on the build that I am currently running in World Tier 4, which is actually not Infinimist anymore, although I did try it, which is again the Blight Corpse Explosion build, I also want to mention some other endgame builds that you can pivot into, including the Sever Necromancer, which basically is also extremely similar to the Blight Corpse Explosion build, except you're swapping Blight for the Sever skill. And also worth mentioning as another variant of a Shadow build is the Shadow Summoner build, which does actually require you to have this unique ring, the Ring of Mendel, and it's actually, if you can pick up the ring, an extremely powerful late game summoner build. But if you do not, or before you find this ring, I would actually not recommend a summoner for tougher content. And with that, coming back to the build I'm playing right now, which again does not actually require you to have any uniques at all, although I am currently using the Howl from Below unique gloves just because I have them. But anyhow, what I like about this build first of all is that again, not only does it retain a lot of the autopilot options from earlier, if you use those specific Malignant hearts, again with the automatic corpse explosions as well as Decrepify casts or Decrepify aura. As you can see, I'm still using both right now, although I did try the damage reduction heart as well. But anyhow, as long as you still have at least the Caged Heart of the Sacrilegious, which is again the corpse explosion heart equipped, you can still opt for the autopilot playstyle whenever the need calls for it, right? Say if you're really just farming easy content, especially if you start building tanky enough and are just farming like lower level nightmare dungeons while watching Netflix or whatever, that is still definitely a viable option. And then whenever you're tackling more difficult content and would like to be more hands-on with your play as well, there's still that option too, especially since you also have Blight, which allows you to sort of play at range and be able to kite enemies or dodge projectiles and whatnot, which means you don't necessarily even have to be super duper tanky when you enter World Tier 4 if you start to play a bit more safely. And getting into these skills really quick, it's still largely the same as the previous autopilot version, except again, you're really just maxing out Blight and then also taking out all of your minion related skills and putting them into all the sacrifice bonuses, right? And as for the skill that'll replace Raised Skeleton on your bar, I recommend Bone Storm because it increases your damage while it's cast as well as survivability, especially with the aspects that I'll talk about in a bit. And then you also make sure to have anything that benefits your damage or corpse generation, such as generating corpses from lucky hits, also generating essence from consuming a corpse, and then any other leftover points you can just distribute as you will through the next point in the tree where the curses are for all the various damage increasing bonuses. And as for gear and aspects, the offensive core that I mentioned earlier of the 3 aspects being the blighted aspect that you get from a dungeon, and then the aspect of decay you get from chapter 3 of your season journey, and then the aspect of grasping veins, which is also from a dungeon. And then besides that, you can also consider the umbral aspect. And then for defense, you'll want disobedience, which again is also available from the codex. The shielding storm aspect is also very good if you go with Bone Storm because it will give you barrier generation. And then you can actually go with the explosive mist aspect as well to further reduce the cooldown of your blood mist to give you more invulnerability and corpse generation uptime. Or if you want, you can go with any other defensive choice too, such as the void aspect is very strong because it actually allows your blight to pull enemies in, acting as sort of a vortex, which is especially useful if you don't have the unique gloves that I have. And then another good alternative for an offensive aspect is the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which will turn your Bone Storm into a shadow spell, which will give you more sources of proccing your Shadow Blight key passive. And last but not least, getting into some Malignant heart options, you'll of course want the Sacrilegious heart for the auto corpse explosion. For your blue brutal heart, you can go with the Decrepify one, although some of the other defensive ones might be decent too, like the life-saving one whenever you take more than 20% of your damage, or the one where you can reduce damage can be quite strong as well. And then for the wrathful hearts that you can equip only one of, first of all, you also want to complete these seasonal questline to unlock one guaranteed wrathful heart. The boss will actually drop one, so you can definitely use that as long as you put it into a decent piece of jewelry because you can only get that once, although you can still farm Wrathful Hearts later on. But generally it doesn't matter too much which Wrathful Heart you get from the quest. As long as you have one that is available, it'll generally be your most powerful option. Although it is also the consensus that if you're able to get it later on, the Caged Heart of the Barber Wrathful Heart seems to be the strongest one out of them all. However, if you're going to be playing later on, especially Infinimist or the Shadow Summoner build, the Caged Heart of the Great Feast, which is specific to Necromancers, might actually be another really powerful choice. And finally, I realized I haven't talked about Paragon at all in this video, but that's because I'm basically just following Maxroll guides for the exact Paragon setup. I'm currently following the Infinimist Paragon configuration from Macro BioBoy. There's also a Corpse Explosion Blight build guide and Paragon board that you can consider using as well, also on Maxroll. And there are also guides for any of the other aforementioned endgame builds in this video that you can check out that I'll link below too. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the video and will enjoy playing these builds as much as I do. Be sure to follow me on Twitch at Measley, and thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. Peace.